Welcome to the very first episode of Deconstructed. In this new series, I'll be talking to you about music that I've produced. I'll be diving into all the details, what production tricks did I use, what software and hardware were used for the sounds, what plugins are present on the master bus. Basically, I'm deconstructing the track here for you in my studio in Rotterdam. So for this very first episode, I've chosen the track 8-Bit Era. The original was released about 11 years ago on Baroque recordings. It's still one of my favorite tunes. It became really popular when Nick Warren used it on his Global Underground compilation. But it was starting to feel a little bit dated, and I really wanted to do a new version that has a little bit of a now feeling to it, so it makes it easier to play in your sets. Instead of the 128 BPM that the original was, I went for 116 BPM. It has more of a disco down-tempo sort of feeling, but I'm really happy with the end result. So I'm looking forward to show you today how I made that track. So for this track, to make it easy, I'm going to divide it into a couple of parts. Drums, percussion, bass, strings, pads, the lead sound, and finally the mix and master. Let's start by going to the drum session. So in this case, I'm using a couple of loops. I'll play my main drum loop for you. So I always divide my drums into stuff that I create using battery and some samples that I have running in the background, or some loops. In battery you can see I'm using the lovely sweet Divine kick from my other track, if you remember. And there's a couple of other stuff that I use all the time, like claps, hi-hats, etc. In this case, it's mainly the kick playing with a snare. And then the loop is filled up with these three loops over here. So a trick that I use a lot is to have some of them go completely to the left channel, others completely to the right, and then I have one in center, which is exactly what I did here. So these loops are all coming from Stylus. Stylus is a drum sampling machine that I use quite a lot. It's really easy because there's a lot of stuff to work with. I've got a couple of expansions as well, and this is just a great starting point for things like shakers and tambourines. So in this case, the left channel is running, or the right channel is running one loop. Then I have a second loop on the left channel. And there's one final loop on the main channel, that's on the left and right channel. So the nice thing, if you combine those three, you feel like it's centered out because of the third loop, but the other two add something all the way on the left and the right side of the spectrum. And I try to put a lot of effort into my stereo sound in mixes. So this is something that I use quite a lot. There's a little bit of processing on it, I think. So they're all going to one channel called Perc. And Perc... Oh, there's only one plugin on it, which is some reverb. It's not very loud, but I use reverb on a lot of my percussion. Sometimes as a send effect, in this case as a insert effect, because I want to be able to change that for the percussion by itself and not having to wonder about all the other drums that are going through the same reverb. So if you have another look at all the drums, there's a few. Oh, the drum loop stays pretty similar for quite a while. There's a hi-hat here that I've added. One thing that's important for my drum sound is the bus channel here. So I use the Neve plugin 1073 a lot. So what I like to do with my drums, this changes throughout the years. So in the past I'd use a couple of different compressors or some other stuff. Right now I'm mainly using this one, sometimes with an extra EQ, but in this case it's just a Neve. So what this plugin does is I'll bypass it for you. It's a pretty aggressive effect. I have it on the verge of distortion, so if I were to turn this up, it becomes noticeable, but I like that it's almost distorting, but actually it is a little bit distorting, but it's just not noticeable with everything on top, you know, and I like that because it gives it a little bit of a analog sort of feel. And the cool thing about this one is I use this to pump up the kick a little bit. Just a little bit. It depends on the bass line as well, how deep that goes, and then I will decide on how to use my EQ over there. One element of this track that is quite important is the live percussion feel that it has. Originally I wanted to work with a live percussionist for this song, but we were running out of time and I had a lot of stuff to do at the time as well. So in the end I decided to handle that section myself as well. Maybe it doesn't feel as live as I originally intended, but I'm pretty happy with the end result. So if you play the percussion and the drums at the end, this is all the percussion playing at once. There's an extra part here. I recorded this through Vienna Ensemble, which is a computer software that lets this computer communicate with one of the other two sampling PCs that I have. So those PCs are all completely loaded up with drum samples, samples I can use for audio, for movie scoring, for commercials. There's lots of sample libraries. So right now it's not connected because those machines are not on, but I can send MIDI to one of the other two machines and it will return audio at one of these channels over here. And it's really cool because it enables me to have some percussion or some heavy samples running with this song on another system, but it doesn't necessarily influence the performance of this computer. So if your processing power or memory is running low, it's a great way to add another computer to the system and expand your possibilities. So for the bass line in this track, it's basically the programming that came from the original 8-bit era tune. So let me show that to you. This was basically the same programming that I used in the original 8-bit era, but I used another sound for it. This time I created the bass line with my modular. I'll show you how I did that in a second. First I'll go through some of the effects that are on this channel. So there's not much processing on the bass line. There's a little bit of guitar rig here. Let me play that for you, exactly what it does. So a little bit of reverb. It's very minimal, it just gives a little bit of depth, and then there's the delay. Delay which has a stereo spread. Again, a very minimal, only 5 out of 100. But it just gives the bass line a little bit of extra depth that it otherwise misses, you know? Oh, it's only playing on the left channel if I bypass that, because I recorded it as a stereo track while it's a mono synth, but I correct that in Guitar Rig at the same time as well. And then besides Guitar Rig, there's another UAD plugin, the Harrison EQ, that adds a little bit of bass and it takes out a little bit of boxiness around 450 Hertz. And last but not least, the sidechaining. So I used to do sidechaining by having a synth trigger another compressor, and then on every synth signal it would sort of compress whatever was going through it. So until someone showed me this tool, it's the X-Fer LFO tool. The cool thing is you can draw your own envelopes, and you can set the rate at which you want them to apply. So this is my sidechaining LFO, but I could make this a lot more aggressive by changing these LFOs. And for instance, you can also do things with panning. So this is a really cool tool. I use this quite a lot. I mainly use it for the panning and the volume functions, but there's like lots of filters here. There's flanges you can choose. There's a lot of stuff you can automate with this. So it's not just a sidechain compressor. It's basically an envelope tool or an LFO tool. But it's very cool. I use it for almost all my sidechaining nowadays. So let me show you how I made this on the modular. So I'm going to show you how I made the bassline for 8-bit era on my modular. Like I just told, the programming is similar to the older 8-bit era track, so the only thing that I changed was the sound. It's actually a very simple sound, and it's been used a million times. It's basically a filtered saw wave. So I have the notes from my computer already playing, and I've got the gate signal here and the CV signal. So we're gonna get the CV signal to go to my Rubicon oscillator. Then we'll get the Rubicon saw wave to go to the filter, which is a Manhattan Analog 35 VCF. From the Manhattan Analog, we'll go to the VCA. And I'll connect the VCA output with my computer. Now you can tell the sound is already there a little bit. Now I just need to connect the envelopes as well. So we're going to go from the gate signal to the VCA. To the envelope. And the envelope is going to go to the VCA. There we go. So as you can tell, we're almost there, but it's not exactly the same. What's missing is the filter envelope. So I'll get this gate signal to go to the filter envelope as well. Then we'll connect that filter envelope to the CV input on the filter. And basically this is almost the bassline that I use. There might be some minute details, but this is basically what I did to get it to sound like this. And what I will often do is I will record this for a couple of minutes. I'll make some changes, like I'll change the filter, I'll change the envelopes. And once I'm happy with my recording, which is like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, I'll cut that up and use that for different bass sections in the track. Then some of the most important parts of the song are the strings and the little detailed sounds that come in at the intro already. So this is one of them. This sound came from the original track. I've put it here for you to play. So this is a sound I recorded 11 years ago from my Virus. It's a VC, so that means Virus C. I've saved it all that time, and I wanted to use it again in this track, of course, because it's such a big element in the original. So I had to pitch it down by quite a bit, but I just looped this section for, what is it, like 2 minutes, and run it through my modular. And the result is, as you can tell, there's a lot of reverb on it. There's also some grain delay going on. I'll show you exactly how I did that. It's not going to be identical, but it'll give you a good idea of what my modular is adding to this sound. So I've processed the sound with a couple of modules from my modular. The computer sends the sound to the audio interface. It goes to the mutable instrument clouds grain delay, and then it goes to the make noise verb, and then it goes back into the computer. So let me show you the sounds you can make like that. So this is the original sound going into the modular. So first, by opening up clouds, I get some grain delay effect. So I will usually use this in the background a little bit. I blend it in like 25%, and I will automate some of these parameters as well. So in this case, I'll turn it up a little bit so you can hear it. There's an LFO on the position. So you get some really crazy effects. I'll usually let these LFOs run free, so I'll make sure they're not synced to the clock, because you get weird, unexpected sort of effects like that. And then most important, I use the verb here, which is a very nice sort of reverb. In this case, it's used sparsely, probably like this, and you can really let this go crazy. In this case, to be honest, I don't remember the exact settings. I will often get a couple of LFOs from the Vermona formulator and just plug them in somewhere, see what happens. I'll record it for 1 or 2 minutes, and when I'm happy with the sound, that's what I'll cut up and use, So in this case, I'm not entirely sure what I did. I might have automated the mix a little bit, which is another trick I use a lot, which is quite cool. But I'm not entirely sure to what extent I used all these parameters. If it's a really original sound, I will save it by making a video. In this case, I just run the sound through some of the parameters. If I'm happy, I'll record it, and that's it. I don't look back. And that's cool, because you get a different way of working, and you get very different results that I wasn't getting when I was just working from my computer, Then, of course, there's the most important string part. So, as you can tell, there's a huge... there's actually 3 parts playing the string part. It's these 2 that are muted, and it's this one. This one is basically a bounce from what I did over here. So, if I play the Forza 10 string, there's one group channel that they go through, and I think that's where the effects are. It's called string. Yeah, here we go. So it looks like I already took off the phaser. So I did. I can just show you how I made that quickly. Forza 10 is a plugin by D16, which I like a lot. It's a controllable space filter, and it does a lot of these cool things. So if you turn up the depth and then turn the rate down quite a bit, you can get a pretty good result. So that's what I basically did for this intro part over here. I bounced this exactly the way I wanted to, and then kept it in audio. I work in audio a lot because the thing is, if you have a phaser like this, just run wild with no clock sync, just like rate sync, sometimes it will go into directions you don't want it to. So I will do a couple of bounces until I'm happy with one, and then I'll keep it in audio to make sure it sounds the same every time I play that part. So this is basically a bounce from that section over there. And then we have the main string line over here, which I think it's an old song. It's an old sample from the original 8-bit era. I think it came from the Blue synthesizer because that's what it says here, but I don't remember anymore, to be honest. I just used the audio file. So apart from a little bit of processing, there's not so much on it. So there's a Moog filter. I really like this filter because it allows you to drive. Allows you to drive the signal quite aggressively, and that gives it a nice, again, analog sort of touch. So apart from this filter, there's a Trident EQ again. Oh, I haven't shown this one actually yet. This is the Trident. Before I used the Harrison one, this is the Trident one. The Trident is a great guitar EQ, and it can really aggressively EQ something. It still sounds musical somehow. And some EQs will go, if you add 10 decibels, they will start to sound very weird, sort of. And this one stays pretty musical, so that's why I use it a lot. And apart from that EQ, again, there's an LFO tool. Great plugin. Use it on a lot of different things. Then there are a couple of recognizable violin stabs that are also coming from the original. I used the same sample that I did for the original track. And these are from my XP30. You can see the patch over here, it's called B54 Violin. The XP30 from Roland was my first hardware synthesizer. It's more of a sample synth. It has some expansion boards. So I've got the orchestral one and techno one, I think some of the standard ones. But I've had this since my 18th birthday. And it has some, it sounds really dated, but sometimes that's what you want. So these sample sounds are very basic, but they give it that sort of housey sort of touch, like some of the old tracks 20 years ago used to have violins and they would sound really cheesy, but it's just a typical sound that I really like, so that's why I went for those again and not something more realistic. The only thing I added is a lot of reverb and a lot of delay. So a really important part of the track is the solo. In the original 8-bit era, it was a 30-second solo that would come in halfway through the song. There's another version of 8-bit era that became more popular. That was the one that Nick Warren used on his Global Underground. And that didn't feature the solo because Nick actually asked me to take it out, especially for the Global Underground. And that eventually became the most popular version of that song. So for this one, I wasn't sure in the beginning if I wanted to use the solo because I knew it would put some people off. What I did in the end was I looped the first two bars from the solo. So these are the first two bars, and I just kept looping them, and that turned out really nice. So I'm playing this with a sound from Omnisphere. It's actually, I think it's a preset actually. It's called Moving Pulse Lead. I might have changed it a little bit, I don't remember. Sometimes I'll use presets, sometimes I create the sounds myself depending on what I'm looking for. In this case the preset fit really well, and I'll play it for you without any effects, which is instantly doesn't sound good anymore. So the most important effect that I added was a reverb. Again, by the D16, it's called Tora Verb. And I like this preset a lot. It's called Let Tail, and then I'll tweak it, however I want it to sound. But this is a nice long sort of reverby sound. It's actually so long that it almost sounds like there's a sort of pad or atmospheric effect in the background. So I quite like that in this case. Then again, there's a Moog filter, which is quite important because it filters in the sound, and I'm filtering this sound in and out a lot. And again, the sidechaining, which is quite aggressive on this sound, as you can see. It's a big part of the sound in total. And then if you play that together with everything else, this is what it sounds like. It's actually funny going over this track again. I think it's one of the songs that have the least components and sounds in them. I mean, usually my tracks are 100 audio tracks long and very complicated in terms of there's stuff happening everywhere. And this version of this song was actually done in I think I did it in one day, which is really unique. I've never done a song in one day. And then I made some changes to it, but again, that was maximum like 1 or 2 times. So this was one of the quickest songs I've ever done. And it's also one of the simplest songs, I'd say. Maybe because I started from the old 8-bit era, so you have something to work from, which greatly speed things up. But again, it's funny that you don't always need to put so much stuff in your track in order to make it sound good, So then after the break, there's another section where the lead sound comes in. And the cool thing is, the original track after the break never went back to those recognizable pads. So these pads didn't return after the break because I introduced a new melody in the break, this one. And that was sort of the melody that would keep on going until the end of the song together with the bass line. So in this version, I specifically wanted to have the pads return after the break. But not just that, I also wanted to make them work with the lead. And that's something that none of the other 8-bit era versions had, like the lead and the strings playing together. And I really like it because it's like the whole song comes together in that part, and I'll play it for you. It happens right here. So this is cool because none of the other 8-bit era versions had this. So there's now 3 different 8-bit era versions, and they're all a little bit different. But I like it. I mean, they're all for different moments, and this is definitely more of a disco down tempo version. So there's one other part I haven't discussed yet, and it's in the breakdown. It's the vocal, which is also quite important. There's actually something funny about this original sample. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's a small hi-hat on top of the sample. And that's because I couldn't find this vocal sample anymore. It's basically, it's pitched vocals, like I pitched them to 2 different heights. But the problem was my sampler that I used in the old arrangement wouldn't open up anymore. So I couldn't find out which vocal sample I used for this. So what I did instead was go to the WAV file of the original 8-bit era, and I looked for the part where this vocal was most prominent without all the other instruments. And I just cut it out there again and then ran it through some processing. So that's why you can hear a sort of a hi-hat sound like right on top of those vocal hits. So funny detail. So there is one other important element in the break, and those are the original vocals. Those were done with text-to-speech, 11 years ago, because I didn't have any good singers, I didn't know any vocalists. I couldn't do it myself because I didn't want like the Dutch accent. So what I did was just, I typed out the words and this is what came out.
8-bit era.
And I just used that, and that's present in the original track and it's also present in this version. I ran those words, I looked up the original samples again and then I ran them through my modular, and I'll show you exactly how I did that. You can hear a lot of messing with the reverb going on.
8-bit era. 8-bit era.
So let me show you how I did that on my modular. So for the vocals, I'm basically using the same trick. They're going through clouds and then through verb again. And cloud in this case is adding a little bit of grain delay.
Bit era.
Little bit of pitched grain delay. Probably again with some sort of LFO on the parameters. Honestly, I don't remember. The most important part in the vocals is the delay for sure. Or I mean the reverb.
8-bit era.
So this is a really important part of the vocals.
8-bit era.
What I'm basically doing is
8-bit era.
turning the size while we're working.
8-bit era. 8-bit era. 8-bit era.
And that's how I made that interesting effect in the breakdown. And I use that trick a lot. You can automate it as well by going through this one. But in this case, I just wanted to exactly do it by hand, so it would go up or down just in between the different vocal phrases. So you get this cool result. So there is one other thing I want to go over with you, and that's my master bus. There's a couple of plugins that I use every single track. It's the Fairchild compressor, which is even on, it's on there right from the start. So I will mix through this and I will even produce through this. So the only thing this does is take off a little bit, like a maximum of 1 decibels. But the cool thing about the Fairchild Fairchild compressor is that it seems to move everything forward a little bit. So it takes out some of the low frequencies by just a little bit. It pushes the highs. At least that's what the effect seems like to me. And if I take it off, you can tell the difference easily. Of course, there's a volume effect that you have to compensate for as well if you really want to compare it. But the Fairchild is known for making everything sound a little bit more forward, and I quite like that. That's why I use it on every single track. And then there's the Harrison EQ, which isn't doing much EQing. Well, it's pushing the highs a little bit here, but that's not really important. What I use the Harrison for all the time is this. It's almost the only filter plugin that I know that if you turn it all the way down, it doesn't affect the sound, and it also doesn't affect the sound if you start to move it upwards. So it's a very, very steep slope, and it doesn't change the bass fundamentals. You know, there's a lot of filters that will, if you have them turned on all the time, it will slightly alter the bass frequencies. This one is as neutral as it gets, so I use this creatively as I would when I'm mixing by taking out the bass for a little bit in this way. And that's why I really love that plugin. And then there's a few others in this case. Let's see. The Manley Massive Passive EQ, also a UAD plugin. In this case, it's actually taking out some of the bass. Wasn't expecting that, but that's what it does apparently here. This song was, well, the bass line from the modular was pretty bass heavy, so that's why it's taking off a little bit of bass there. There's the BX Digital EQ, which is, again, it's not doing much. It's changing the stereo width from 100 to 105%, and it's taking, I have it set up in mid side, and if you solo the side signal, it's taking off the low frequencies there. So it's making sure there's no really deep bass in the left and the right channel by itself, and it's only going through the center channel. I like this because it gives you, by working in mid-side mode, it gives you a different way of EQing things than just by working in left-right mode. So that helps me a lot usually. Then there is the Oxford Inflator. It seems to do a lot, but that's also because the volume changes when you turn it on. In this case, because I have it set up all the way to the maximum. It just takes off some of those peaks that would normally otherwise get taken off by the limiter. In this case, the limiting is very weak. As you can see, it's not really taking anything off because I still send it out to mastering afterwards. So I make sure that if the limiter is on, it's basically not doing anything. If I would master it myself, I would try to get it somewhere here. I'm usually happy when my limiter takes off a maximum of 1.5, 2.5. As soon as I see this happening, you can see it's taking off too much. I would go back into the arrangement and go back to the track to change things so the limiter doesn't have to work so hard. But in this case, the limiter is doing almost nothing because it's basically just keeping the volume below the ceiling. And I send it off to mastering for the final touches. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I've tried to give you as much details as possible, but if you still have any questions left, feel free to post those in the comment section and I'll try to respond to that as well as I can. So regarding this track, 8-Bit Era, the Balearic mix is out on Days Like Nights right now. I'm also happy to announce that Nick Warren is coming up with a remix as well. As you know, he played a really big part in the original, so having him on board and remix this track is a really big thing for me. So regarding the series Deconstructed, I'll be posting more of this on my YouTube channel. I'm looking forward to suggestions. Let me know what track you would like to see deconstructed, and I will have a look at that and see if I can implement some of them in the future. For now, thank you again for tuning in and take care.